Welcome. Hopefully you can see our welcome screen that is up. You are at the Managing for Wildlife Workshop number 2. So this is a forester event, and we were trying to have a Managing for Wildlife Workshop, which was a day-long event back in March, but thanks to COVID, we had to move to more virtual setting here. So welcome to our second virtual meeting. And today we're going to talk about invasive plants and their impact on wildlife. And then we're going to talk about landscaping for wildlife with native plants. As you can see, this meeting is being recorded, so it will be available from our YouTube channel a little later. So if there's something you missed or something you want to go back and review, that option is available. All right, so here is just a glimpse of our agenda. Again, my name is Jennifer Roach. I'm a district forester with the North Carolina Forest Service, and I will be your host today, your moderator, and take you through this. Once again, this is our Forester event. This is Forester North Carolina, and we are very excited that you have chosen to join us today and talk about managing for wildlife. All right. Great, thank you for that, Laurel. So we definitely want to communicate with you all out there. It looks like we've got folks from Buncombe County, Transylvania County, all the way down to Swansboro, here in the Piedmont, from Chapel Hill, Durham, Raleigh. So we've got a really good crowd here, and we do want to be able to connect with you. So please, as we go along while the speakers are presenting, if you have a question, please type it in that question and answer box. We want to know. Laurel Case is behind the scene and going to try to answer those. We also have Deanna Noble, who is with the North Carolina Wildlife Commission, who is also behind the scenes, that will be answering some of those questions. Kelly Douglas, I believe, is still on here joining us with the USDA Wildlife Services, that is behind the scenes and helping answer questions. So please, if you have a question, put it out there. We'd love to hear from you. At the end of each presentation, I will look at the questions that it looks like most people want to hear or hear the answer for, and we'll ask those questions to our presenters. So once again, great way to communicate, and so ask those questions if you have them. So of course, here in Forester, we are all about communicating and really wanting to learn a little more about you. So we do have some poll questions. So Laurel, if you can pull up the first poll question. We appreciate everyone playing along with us here. Okay, so our first poll question is this your first time joining a Forester North Carolina event? Yes or no? Obviously, if you joined us from one of our face-to-face workshops last year or our virtual meeting we had in September, you are very familiar with Forester, so thank you and welcome back. If this is your first time, well, we are so glad that you found a topic that interests you, and we're glad that you're taking the time to join us today. So, Laurel, all right, it looks like it's close, very close, almost half and half. So a little more of the participants have been with us before, so that's great, great. Glad to have you back. And it looks like a little less than half of you are joining for the first time. So we are glad that you got this information about this workshop and hope that this is beneficial to you. Our second poll question, so thanks for playing along. We've got a second question there. Laurel, if you want to throw that one up. All right, so we want to know where you come from. So thank you for putting your county or your city in the chat box, but we also kind of want to understand what region of North Carolina that you're from. So we'll give you a few seconds to just click that. Maybe you're from the coastal plain or Piedmont or mountains. Or maybe you're joining us from outside North Carolina, which we're glad to have you. That's awesome. But just so you know, our plan for Forester was to have a workshop in each of our regions across the state. That way you do get a little more local information, but going virtual, we know that's hard, so that helps us to understand. All right, well, it looks like we have an overwhelming majority from the Piedmont of North Carolina, so that is great. The Piedmont is representing today. And we've got several folks from the coastal plain and the mountains, and it looks like a few from outside of North Carolina. So thank you. Thanks for joining us. All right. Well, I am going to stop talking, and without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker today is Margaret Fields, who is with the Nature Conservancy, and she's going to talk about the impacts on wildlife from invasive plants. All right, Margaret, I hand it over to you.
Well, everybody,
Yes.
Thanks for joining. Great. I appreciate you spending your time with us. My name is Margaret Fields. I work at the Nature Conservancy usually in our Durham office. I'm working out of my house in Carborough these days. And I work on kind of statewide invasives issues. And then we have satellite offices around the state where we work on our invasives on our local property. I also am a member of the North Carolina Invasive Plant Council, and that is a local group. We have an annual meeting where we discuss all things invasives and how it relates to North Carolina and what we're trying to do. So with this presentation, I'm going to give a general overview about invasive plants and how they affect our natural world and where that touches down in North Carolina. And then at the end, I will mention a few different resources that you can refer to as far as looking at on your property and understanding about what's going on in your backyard. And feel free to pop questions. We can take a break here and there during the presentation or take them at the end, however that works. So let me see here. If my PowerPoint is working. There we go. All right. Is everybody seeing my second slide? I feel like there's a few second delay with some folks. So North Carolina, I am 51 and I was born in North Carolina, and there are 5 million more people living in North Carolina than when I was born. We gain about 1 million a decade. So with this population growth, we have our metro areas expanding and adding roads and power lines and things like that. And all of this is fragmenting our natural areas. And so with that, we are introducing people, plant all kinds of things in their yards, and a lot of them just stay there, but some of them are invasive. And with that, it can affect the areas that have native plants that we are trying to keep natural. So I'm going to discuss some of that. It's a study from 1994. I don't have the specifics on how they define these different sizes of towns, but suffice to say, the bigger the settlement and the town or city, the fewer native species are present, and the more exotic species there are. And as you see in this picture as an example, and I see this on older yards too. This is a Chinaberry tree. So it's a tree from Asia that is planted in somebody's yard. It's a pretty tree, but it is kind of invasive, and it's not what our native wildlife evolved with. Go over some definitions here. Native species, we define that as pre-European colonization. So things from 500 years, they didn't exist 500 years ago when Europeans started colonizing North America. We considered those newer species as being exotics. And exotic species were brought by humans, either deliberately or accidental, and planted here. And everything that was here already, we define that as being native. This picture right here is garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is a bad invasive more in the Northeast, but we have had some bad infestations in North Carolina. It was brought over for cooking. It's an herb spice, and it turns out that it grows, taken out of its natural habitat with checks and balances, it grows really well, especially if it's a little wet and it's kind of sunny. So if you see garlic mustard on your property, it is something that you would want to eradicate or it will take over. Some more definitions. Benign exotics. We got a picture here of a hydrangea. We, plant hydrangeas in our yard. They grow really well and they stay where they're put. So that's the kind of thing that is not getting out and harming our sort of native natural areas. But invasive exotics, vinca, which might be planted right next to that hydrangea, vinca will spread with its rhizomes and take over areas and affect how useful it is for the natural occurring animals and the ability for other plants to live there. My neighbor has some vinca that I'm just watching it sort of creep closer and closer to my property line every year. So what is an invasive? How do we define invasive plants? They tend to have one or many of these characteristics. Prolific seed producer. This picture right here is of Microstitium, Japanese stiltgrass. This is something that it's producing its seed this time of year, September, October, and the seed is not just a little seed head at the top of the grass. It goes all the way up through the stalk of the grass. So this Japanese stiltgrass infestation we're looking at there are potentially millions of seeds there. It's an annual, but that seed bank will stay there for a long time. And a lot of these invasives, once they get established, they tolerate extreme conditions and they have long seed viability. Woolly mullen, if you're familiar with woolly mullen, that will pop up in disturbed sites, and they have found woolly mullen seeds that are 1,000 years old and they're still viable. So there are some plants that may not be that aggressive, but they will sit in the seed bank and wait for their opportunity. Adaptations for dispersal. Mile-a-minute weed is showing up some places in the foothills, and then beach vitex, which we've had a problem with on the coast. Both of those have seeds that will float for up to a week. So you get a storm on the coast and you have beach vitex somewhere, it could go a county or two away to another sand dune and start a new colony of beach vitex. And same with the mile-a-minute weed, it will go downriver and start a new colony. Vegetative reproduction, like the stiltgrass here, things that grow prolifically and create a lot of biomass and outcompete the other herb layer in that instance. Allelopathic, allelopathic plants alter the soil. It's usually a chemical that they produce that discourages other plants from growing. Tree of Heaven is one I'll show you later. It will grow in a grove because it will be able to discourage other plants from growing by being allelopathic, which I find especially sneaky. Here's a list, and you'll have access to these presentations later, so you don't need to necessarily write them down. These are what we consider to be the worst as far as aggressive, common invasives that affect our natural areas. We all know about kudzu. It's locally very intense, but it doesn't seed out. At least at this point, we don't find kudzu seeding out, but wherever it occurs, it will overtop trees and kill them. Privet is now in a lot of natural areas being carried by birds, the seed being carried by birds. Exotic wisteria. This is one that everybody is sad to hear when they're so beautiful in the springtime, but the Wisteria vines with their big purple blooms, they will overtop and kill trees. They're sort of in the kudzu realm, although they do seed out. we've managed a property that's an old home site and had a wisteria vine on an arbor. So it was in a contained space, but then wisteria kept popping up in the woods away from there because of those seed pods. And Japanese honeysuckle, it doesn't climb up and kill big trees, but it will strangle smaller woody shrubs, and it can tolerate shade. So it will go to the woods in the Piedmont, really anywhere except for maybe sandy or peaty acidic soils. I see honeysuckle around. In the sandhills, it seems to be less common because there's not a lot of nutrients in that soil. And the Japanese stiltgrass we talked about. Multiflora Rose is a plant that was encouraged in the mid 20th century as a sort of living fence for cattle, but it turns out that it grows a big thorny mess and it does not offer any benefits to wildlife. So Multiflora Rose turned out to be a bad idea. Sericea lespedeza, we'll show that a little more later. It is planted for erosion control. The DOT still plants Sericea, and when you see them regrade the side of the road, you'll see a bunch of lespedeza there. And Tree of Heaven, we mentioned, Princess Tree, and then Chinese silvergrass is what's in this picture here. And that's been a popular planting for yards, and it's very persistent, but the seeds are viable. They will make a hybrid version where they're not viable, but then they can revert. So the stretch of I-40 around Morganton, Marion, Old Fort, it's between 1,000 and 2,000 feet elevation, I believe. And it is a solid wall of Chinese silvergrass now on the sides of I-40 there. And that wasn't there 25 years ago. It is a perfect example of what happens as the invasive plant takes advantage. And that open disturbed ground, all those cars going by, the seeds get on the breeze there, and it is spread for miles. So things like that. This is a good list of things that if they show up on your property, you should control them if at all possible. Here are a bunch of other ones. I'm not going to go through all of them, but it is a good list if you're keeping an eye on these things. The picture here is of Oriental Bittersweet, which is another big vine. Invasive vines can be especially damaging because they'll crawl all over everything. So I don't know if that's on top of a house or what, but it's a good example of Oriental Bittersweet. Let's see, tallow tree. Tallow tree is more southern than here. But with things like climate change, Chinaberry, I see Chinaberry along ditches in South Carolina more than up here. It seems to behave a little better, but as things get warmer and wetter, I just wonder if these will start to become more aggressive, just looking at how they behave just a little south of here. And how they're introduced. Ornamentals, we've gone through some of those with miscanthus. Wildlife food, autumn olive and privet. This is a autumn olive here. Autumn olive has become a lot more common. I feel like Hurricane Fran in the 90s spread autumn olive everywhere, and opened up a lot of places in the forest canopy where the seeds that were carried there by birds like privet had an opportunity to establish and grow. So you see these shrubs in the woods a lot more than you used to. Erosion control, packing material, Japanese stiltgrass. This is a good example of it's not that just one plant comes to North America and spreads all over the place. They must have been packing things that were being shipped from Asia in Japanese stiltgrass for years for it to spread and then establish here. So trying to be more conscientious about what is with international commerce is a big part of trying to reduce the number of invasives that are showing up in our landscape. Excuse me. The nursery, it's interesting because the things that make something invasive are also the things that are very attractive to the nursery. There are things that grow easily and they have berries. They don't give way to things like drought and pests. And that means that the nursery tends toward hardy plants that could become invasive. Here's Nandina. We've been planting Nandina in our yards forever, and they do stay there. I see little sprouts coming up here and there, but when you're talking about plants that are beneficial for wildlife, Nandina is one where the berries are poisonous to birds. So I know that Debbie's gonna talk about a lot of plants that are more useful for wildlife, that they could perform the same, they could be just as attractive, but then also have a use for wildlife and not just be a plant that's poisonous for birds in the yard. That's hard to kill as well. Another thing invasive plants do is with displacing the native plants, they dominate disturbed sites and they alter ecological processes. So the silvergrass that I mentioned in the foothills, when the wildfires were happening in the fall of 2016, some of those areas around the South Mountains and sort of the eastern side of the escarpment have some silvergrass occurrences, some infestations. And where fire occurs with this miscanthus, it can be hotter and it can end up with higher tree mortality and really just having a more destructive fire, which then again gives more opportunity for invasives to grow. And the silvergrass loves it. It comes back with a vengeance. Another fun thing for thinking about how you're managing your property is the more diverse plants you have, the more diverse wildlife you have. Over the past few years, I've been putting in more and more pollinator host plants in my yard, and it's amazing how the butterflies and the hummingbirds and then the birds, and it all kind of feeds on itself. And if you have a simple landscape, you have more of the generalists. I still have plenty of deer in my squirrels, but the more different kind of plants you have, the more different kind of wildlife you can support. And I forgot to mention at the beginning, Chris Moorman, who's a wildlife biology professor at NC State, is the person who I got a lot of this material from, and he's done a lot of very arduous studies trying to quantify how invasives affect wildlife, and done a lot of bird studies. So this is interesting that the plants that birds evolve with, the shrubs that they make their nests in, etc., for the most part, they have more nest success when they can use those native plants. And if it's other plants that are from other parts of the globe, they don't necessarily have as much success. Chris did have a note that there was one exception with the veery having more nest success in a barberry, and he's he's a good researcher, so it probably was statistically significant. But I do find that, yeah, you give the native wildlife what they evolved with, they will be more successful. Management. If you have property that you manage, which, I mean, if you have property, hopefully you do manage it, you're going to be doing some disturbance. If that's bush hogging or logging or mowing or burning. And disturbance is one thing that can bring out the invasives. It also, here's an example where the northern bobwhite does thrive on disturbance. It wants a low, herby sort of cover, so that, because it's a ground nesting bird. So this was, I think, in Hill Forest in northern Durham County, where they were improving bobwhite habitat. So they were opening up the canopy and getting out the shrubs and burning. And this is what can happen. You have your bobwhite and then your management, but then up comes a bunch of Sericea lespedeza. There can be a cascade of invasive species that you are working through the seed bank of when you are managing your property and trying to get to a certain desired condition. So that does come with the territory. So knowing what those plants are and how to get rid of them when that's what's called for is necessary to be able to get to a desired condition that you want on your property. And you can see Jimmy here is not at all happy about this, this lespedeza. Timber management. The Southeast can grow trees better than really anywhere else in our country. Everything grows very rapidly. So we have a lot of timber management in North Carolina on a variety of sizes of properties. And if you are dealing with that, I want, and really for all of you, if there's one thing you take away from this talk, I've said this for the past few years at all my talks, it is identifying Kogon grass. This is a picture of Kogon grass in flower. Kogon grass flowers May, June in North Carolina. It was introduced in the Port of Mobile, and it was presented as forage for cattle. I think there was another use they tried to market it for, but cattle don't like it, and it is a very aggressive invasive. It seeds out and it rhizomes, and it outcompetes everything and completes it and creates a complete monoculture. So it is not in North Carolina so much. We've had a few different incidents of it that have been identified and treated. It is a federal noxious weed. The Department of Agriculture has an interest in eradicating it if it does show up on your property. It is more in the Gulf states and in Florida. And it is a very expensive, it makes doing anything on the land where it is more expensive. So you do want to know what Kogon grass is. If you Google Kogon grass, there is an 18-page booklet on how to identify it, which goes into all the structures of the plant. And you can call the Department of Agriculture. So it is a perfect example of how an invasive plant can get in the way of being able to manage your timber. It will grow faster than seedlings, and it has very pointy rhizomes. It will pierce other roots. And then other invasives also will do overtopping and twining and cause tree mortality. So keeping this in mind, especially as we were talking about management, if you're in there with equipment, then you need to keep a lookout for new invasives to to be popping up. Aquatic invasives is a whole other topic, and there are some bad ones out there. This is a picture of Hydrilla. Hydrilla has showed up in a lot of lakes over the past 10, 15 years, mainly on the props of boats, of fishermen going lake to lake, but not cleaning their equipment. They can change the soil and the pH, and they can affect fish kills. And so being able to manage those and not let them get out of control, like this spot in Carr Lake, is key for having a healthy pond or lake. So North Carolina has an aquatic invasive species management division that you can find on the web, and they do have a good list of the bad aquatic invasives. So we think of it as, it takes 100 years for things to really get established and then cause a problem. But I think with all the big, Caterpillar tractors out there making new housing developments and our international commerce flying things around the world, that it's faster than that. But China is a temperate region. There was not a lot of access to China in the 20th century communist regime, but there are lots of horticulture hunters there looking for the next big thing to bring to the nursery to put in your yard. They do need to go through a risk assessment before they are let in the country, but that is really the best guess on if it's going to be invasive here or not. Until you bring it here and have it live here a while, we are not sure. So it is good to keep a lookout for that. Here's a picture of Mahonya. I see Mahonya in the woods here and there. It has those droops with the grapes on it. Oregon grape is what it's called, and it will get carried out into the woods by birds. And people will think it's a holly or something, but it's a Mahonya. Managing, it's good to have a lot of tools in your toolbox, and herbicide is one of those. You don't have to use herbicide. You can use things like weed wrenches, mechanical means to get the roots out of really stubborn shrubs and things like that. But Roundup is cheap, and you can use just a light touch of it, and it will kill a lot of weeds and make managing invasives a lot simpler. So being able to read the MSDS and follow the instructions on how you use it is important. And helping slow the spread of invasives. You attending this talk, I think, is great for getting educated about invasives. And yeah, talking to the neighbors about their weeds is not always productive, but sometimes, you never know. It's good to have best practices with being able to reduce transmission of invasives. So cleaning anything that you're hitting the dirt with, your boots, your bike, your boat, all those things. And yeah, not contributing wild organisms around the world is also a good practice. And with gardening, it really, with the Invasive Plant Council, we try to communicate with nurseries and with big box stores not to sell invasive plants, but they want to hear from customers. It's a very complicated chain of supply, and for the Invasive Plant Council to tell them not to sell something isn't effective. If you are a consumer and you see that your favorite nursery is selling things that are invasive and you think that's irresponsible, feel free to tell them. I think they need that feedback more. And yep, just not letting your cat out to eat the birds. That's also a good thing. So here are a few resources that you could find easily on the web. This was a book. If we were in person, I would try to have some of these books to hand out to you, but more and more they are just putting these publications on the web. So it's a PDF on the web. This goes into identification of common invasive plants in the Southeast, broken into their categories of shrub and vine and herb, and very informative. Also gives you management tips, what kind of chemical to use, what mix to use, when to use it, what kind of strategies there are for knocking back these invasives. It's already been studied and figured out, so you don't have to just go out there on your own and chop on things and hope for the best. The Northbound Invasive Plant Council, we have a good website that emphasizes the big bad invasive plants for the different regions of North Carolina. Check it out. And iNaturalist is I use it mainly as an app on my phone. It is a crowdsourced plant ID, animal ID, any kind of ID. And it is very popular. It has gotten a lot smarter over the past few years as that crowdsourced data has been fed into the algorithm. So you can take a picture of a leaf or a plant and it will give you a half a dozen suggestions for what it thinks they are. You don't have to actually put it out there and say, hey, what is this? It will identify, and then you go through the choices and you can usually find what it is within 5 minutes, which is really handy. I use it all the time out in the field. And here's my email if you have any other questions. So that's what I have for my presentation.
Okay, that's great, Margaret. We do have a few questions. As you were talking there, Kelly and Laurel have been busy answering a lot of questions specific to just determining what species someone may have in their yard. But one of the questions for the group would be, is the DOT allowing, or are they planting ornamental grasses along the roadside?
DOT, they're another hard nut to crack as far as what their plantings are. They have moved away from some invasives, and they do have their wildflower program and some plots here and there. Ornamental grasses, I'm not sure about that. They used to plant a lot of Eleagnus, which they have moved away from. I can say that's a good thing. But yeah, I'm not sure about ornamental grass. That would be nice.
Okay. What about Japanese stiltgrass? We know that's very problematic, particularly as it moves through the forest as well. What is some control methods for that?
Yeah, there's hand pulling, but it can kind of overwhelm you. And like I said, I think of Labor Day as the time, if you have it in a small area that you want to manage. I think of Labor Day as the time to seed, and so going out and pulling it at that time is good. If it's in an area that you're never gonna eradicate it from, weed whacking it back to be very short at that time helps with the seeds that it sets. But it also will take maybe a 3% Roundup solution. It doesn't take much to kill it if you want to treat it with chemical. But yeah, that's one that just overwhelms you with the seed bank. We're trying to manage it on a very large preserve in the sandhills these days, and it's constant vigilance for sure.
Yes, most definitely. All right, what's your thoughts on wisteria?
Thoughts? Well, the native wisteria, I think, is a nice, it has a lot of the same characteristics as the invasive wisteria and is not as aggressive. It is a vine, so it will climb, but you can manage it on an arbor better. Yeah, wisteria is definitely invasive and destructive to trees.
Okay, I got a few more here for you. So what is your top 3 things that you would give to a homeowner to educate them about invasive plants and maybe choosing the plants that they put in their yard?
That's a good question. Well, what is your goal? And how much management do you want to do? And again, I will say that Debbie knows a lot more about these things than I do as far as what natives to plant. But with invasives, I mean, stay away from things like English ivy and manage things that plant natives where you can, but also just like we talked about, educating yourself about the ones that are particularly invasive and affect your neighbors with things like miscanthus that seed out. That isn't really concise 3 messages, but yeah, natives, and yeah, staying away from the bad invasives. I don't know.
Okay. All right, that's great. Thank you for that. And just one more. I think you talked a little bit about this, about trying to stop nurseries or educating nurseries, big box stores on selling invasive. And who again is the best way to talk with those groups, or how do you get that message across?
Yeah, there are, I know that Mountain True in Asheville has worked on a program with local nurseries to be an approved nursery. And ideally, if we could have a national kind of program like that, where nurseries get approved for, are they being responsible with what they sell? But that is not happening. You know, we get all kinds of, we've met with Lowe's and they're not going to give up their right to sell whatever they want. So I wish there was a way to tag things. We have this flagging that says invasive. So picture your basic flagging, except it says invasive on it. And I've wanted to go around the Green and Growing show in Greensboro with it and just tie it on plants all over the complex. Hopefully, and at Lowe's, I don't know how knowledgeable they are, but at some of the smaller nurseries, the people working there are knowledgeable and they will be honest about it, but they don't tag things or say, you know, this aquatic plant is for a water garden, do not release this in the stream or anything like that. They keep it much more simple, and they leave it up to you to educate yourself, unfortunately.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you so much for your experience and slideshow. Native plants or invasive plants are truly a concern for all landowners and all land managers that are out there, particularly when it comes to trying to simply control them or contain them, when many times eradicating is not possible. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks so much for being interested.
Thank you, Margaret. All right, so Margaret talked about the bad things. Let's go to our next speaker, and let's talk about the good things that we would like to see here in North Carolina. So our next speaker, Debbie Roos, is going to talk about native plants and their impacts on wildlife. So Debbie, the floor is yours.
Well, but y'all let me know if you can't see it, because I don't really know what you can see. Anyway, hello everybody. Now that we've wasted 5 minutes, which is not anybody's fault because we actually practiced this, I'm really excited to talk to y'all about landscaping for wildlife. I actually ran through this talk this morning and it was a little long, and it was really hard for me to take slides off because I get really excited about plants and insects. Oh, and I can see I can't use my space bar. Are you seeing my second slide?
Yes, we are.
Just checking. So I got into this. I've been doing landscaping for with native plants for wildlife for about 20 years, and I really got into it through pollinator gardening. I'll let you in on a little secret. When you garden for pollinators, you actually are gardening for lots of other wildlife besides pollinators, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that. And all the photos in this talk are from my pollinator garden in Pittsburgh, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. With a couple of exceptions, if I've put somebody else's name on the photo, that means it's not mine. So let's talk a little bit about what wildlife needs. Obviously, all kinds of food, from seeds, nuts, fruits, leaves, insects, nectar, and pollen. They need water. They need protective cover, nesting sites, and then protection from harmful pesticides. I also want to give you a little warning. I do tend to go pretty quickly for topics I'm really excited about, but that's kind of the neat thing with Zoom is that you can watch the recording later. So how do we provide those needs? You can do it through a managed landscape around your home, through fields, and through woodlands. So today I'm talking about those managed landscapes, but the November 12th Forest Her webinar is going to focus on the fields and woodlands portion. So if you haven't registered for that, look for that. And the typical landscape is mostly yard in the US, about 90% lawn, believe it or not. And these typical landscapes only have about 10% of the original biomass of trees that was there before the house was built. And in addition to all of that, about 80% of the plants are not native. So that's what we're dealing with. It's a very sterile environment for wildlife. But the good news is we can all make a difference, just in little changes that you make in your home, whether even on a small scale. I really do believe it all adds up. And if you start making these changes, you'll be rewarded by seeing a lot more wildlife. And it's not just a aesthetic viewing pleasure of wildlife. You can see increased pollination services, possibly even some improved pest control for your garden and that kind of thing. So what are the steps? Margaret went through and talked about the impacts of some of these invasive species. So you'd want to remove those, get on a plan to start removing those if you have those. Think about minimizing your lawn area. We're not saying don't have any lawn, but think of it more as an area rug and not wall-to-wall carpeting. And then also other things you can do besides landscaping with native plants is think about your outdoor lighting. That can have a very negative effect on wildlife. So, think about motion detector lights or installing water features or bubblers or bee hotels, all kinds of things you can do in addition to native plants that will help wildlife in your area. So what we're talking about today is using those native plants. You also want to avoid or minimize the use of pesticides. I always tell people it doesn't do any good to plant pollinator habitat if you're not going to be careful about using pesticides. Also, Margaret hinted at this also, work with your neighbors. You may be able to collaborate on some habitat issues. And then also think about your pets. Again, it's not going to do any good to landscape for birds if you've got a couple of cats running around outside murdering all the birds that you attract to your landscape. So we're going to focus now on talking about landscaping for wildlife. This is the picture from my demonstration garden. We put together a poll. Laurel, I've got a couple of polls through here to kind of gauge some of your interest. Laurel, if you want to do that, share that poll.
Which poll did you want?
Oh, well, I numbered them, number 1 and 2. This is the one for, what species, what are you most interested in attracting? Did you get those? Yep. Which wildlife species are you most interested in attracting to your landscape? Do you want to see birds, pollinators, reptiles, and amphibians, or all of the above? I have a feeling I know what y'all are going to say. Okay, how's the vote coming in? Okay, so yep, that's what I thought. The majority of y'all, 66%, said all of the above. Interesting. Only 5% said reptiles and amphibians. I guess I shouldn't be too surprised about that. You know, I'm on a mission to like change people's minds about wasps. They have a very negative view among most people. I think snakes do as well. But I happen to be a snake lover myself. And I used to have pet snakes. So I think they're good. You know, I think most of them, you know, we have very few venomous snakes in the area. Just be aware of what's what. But thanks for participating in that. So the basic steps to improving your native plant landscaping, it's helpful to inventory what you already have, decide what you want to remove, whether it's an invasive plant or something that's not really pulling its weight, and then where you might want to augment. You know, it's helpful to develop some kind of basic design. It doesn't have to be fancy. If you want to hire someone, if you've got the resources for that, that's great, but that's not necessary if you want to do something small on your own. And then I do encourage people to start small and do this in stages. The best time to plant is right now. I've been really busy out in my garden, actually doing fall planting. Fall is a good time to get trees, shrubs, and herbaceous perennials established and get them a good footing for the following year. And don't neglect the step of making sure things get about 1 inch of water a week for that entire first year after they're planted. And then after that, they should be good to go. They should have a good root system, be drought tolerant, and you should not need to provide much supplemental irrigation after that first year. So some general guidelines for landscaping for wildlife. I do like to encourage people to emphasize native plants. I'd like to recommend this author, Doug Hallamy. If you haven't read his books or not familiar with him, he is a University of Delaware entomologist. He's written some amazing books that I think can really change a lot of people's minds about the impact of our choices that we make in plant selection and the impact of that on wildlife. His first book was Bringing Nature Home, and it's just packed full of data on you know, how trees and native versus exotic affect wildlife. And basically, you know, when these suburban landscapes that are 80% exotic plants, having a very negative effect on seeing declining populations of invertebrates and birds and other critters. So really what you plant in your landscape is going to determine what you see and what lives in your landscape. And the food web out there, caterpillars are essential to sustaining that food web because most animals don't eat plants directly. And so caterpillars are really the foundation of a strong, sustainable food web. 96% of our terrestrial birds feed insects to rear their young. And these are primarily caterpillars because they're big, they're nutritious, and they're soft. They don't damage a nestling's throat, and they're easy to digest. And so those are really important to reproduction of our songbirds and many other, excuse me, went the wrong way, many other, as you go on up the food web as well. So Doug Hallamy's done a lot of research on this. He looked at the impact of plant choices on songbird reproduction. He particularly looked at the Carolina chickadee. And so a mom and a dad bird work together to raise the young. They work from sunup to sundown to collect caterpillars, bringing back an average of 1 caterpillar every 3 minutes for their nestlings. It's very industrious, and it takes 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just to raise 1 clutch of chickadees. And guess where those caterpillars are coming from? They're coming from the native plants because those are the plants that support them. You'll find very few caterpillars in general on exotic plants like crepe myrtles and Bradford pears. And he would tell a story that would bring a tear to your eye of how his researchers would find nests full of dead nestlings and sunflower seeds. And what would happen is after about a week, the parent birds would be unable to find more caterpillars. They just exhausted the supply, and then they would start bringing back sunflower seeds because that's what they ate. But of course, baby birds cannot digest sunflower seeds, so they would literally starve to death. So it's also helpful to think about the term Keystone Species. This is a term that ecologists have used, sorry, trigger happy on the button there. Ecologists have used this term for decades, and basically it's species that are so vital as part of the food web that if they were no longer there, they would drastically change that ecosystem. And Hallamy uses that concept and talks about particularly keystone plants So these are plants that have a really big impact on the abundance and diversity of other species. So these plants, of course, are essential to that food web. And so if we want to help wildlife, it behooves us to incorporate some of these plants into our landscapes. And so research has shown that if you don't have these keystone genera in your landscape, you're going to see a significant drop in caterpillars. And we just talked about how important caterpillars were to the entire food web. And the other key thing to keep in mind is native plants are not all created equal. So it's really, you've really got your workhorse plants, your keystone plants. 5% of the native plants are actually hosting about 75% of the caterpillars. So we'll talk a little bit more about what those plants are in a little bit. Another general guideline for landscaping is to try to create layers in your landscape that mimic nature. So what we're talking about here is that vertical vegetation structure that's really important to especially birds. You've got your high canopy layer with your large trees. A mid-story layer would be smaller trees or large shrubs. And your shrub layer could be shrubs and herbaceous perennials, and then your ground cover. So each of those layers supports different types of animals. It's really important to have that layering effect. It's also important to plant a diversity of plants that are going to provide blooms, seeds, and fruits throughout the entire year. So you can see this is all taken in the Pollinator Garden, lots of diversity out there from spring through the summer, and of course now we're into the fall. So lots of things still blooming now and also seeds available. So another step would be, of course, to plant those keystone plants that I was talking about. Some examples of those, one of the best examples would be the oaks. Oaks have been found to support over 550 species of caterpillars in the mid-Atlantic and nationwide over 900 species. Other examples of keystone plants would include maples and hickories and willows. And it's not just your trees, it can be herbaceous plants and grasses as well. Elms, asters, goldenrods, and perennial sunflowers can be good keystone plants. I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. Also, this may not seem obvious to a lot of people, but you know, when you're thinking about especially a pollinator garden or flowering garden, is native grasses. They're very underutilized in my opinion. I'm a big fan of them. They're really important. They can be host plants for butterflies, which you don't obviously think of, but they're also important shelter, nesting sites, and also food for animals. So again, these can be really nutritious seed. Some of our native bees that are cavity nesters, like bumblebees, will often be found nesting at the base of grasses. And they also provide a lot of shelter for wildlife in general. One tip though, is if you're gonna have native grasses, don't cut them back in the fall when they die back or turn brown, because really half the reason of having them is that they persist and provide structure and shelter throughout the winter. So I wait until late winter, early spring to even think about cutting my grasses back, right before they're gonna start growing again. So here's just some examples of grasses that I have in my pollinator garden, some of my favorite natives, and some of these are quite short, like the prairie drop seed, and the little blue stem could be a foot or 2 feet high, and others can be quite tall. The split-beard blue stem, for example, and the switchgrass can be quite tall. So there's a lot of options out there for they're beautiful and they're very functional and helpful to wildlife. Here's an example of bumblebees nesting at the base of grasses in a meadow situation. Because again, they're just kind of looking for that cavity that can be formed at the base. Oh, I keep going the wrong way. Okay, so a little tiny button here. It's also, so now we're going to talk a little bit about unlandscaping. If you can, if it's acceptable, if you have a part of your yard that maybe is hidden from view, it can be very helpful to leave a portion of your yard that's undisturbed. Why would you do that? Well, because if you have an area where you're not mowing or tilling or planting, that really can serve as really important overwintering and nesting habitat for a variety of creatures. That undisturbed area can also include dead trees or stumps, you know, snags that provide cavities for bees and beetles and birds and mammals, and you know, just wildlife snags. And you can have brush piles and rock piles. You can even purposely construct brush piles. We've got an NC State publication that talks about how to do that. Also, if you're able to let the leaf litter accumulate, that also is very important. Overwintering habitat for hibernating bumblebee queens. And it also protects a lot of our butterfly and moth chrysalids that overwinter. So that can be really important as well. That's that, we hear that phrase, leave the leaves. So now we're going to talk specifically about a couple of groups of wildlife. So we'll start with pollinators and then we'll go to birds. And a little bit more about the pollinator garden. This is in Pittsburgh. This is a garden that I created back in 2008 here in Pittsburgh and Chatham County. I've really expanded it over the years. It now has over 220 species and 85% of them are native to North Carolina. It's open to the public. Anybody's welcome to visit. I'm going to try to lure a few of y'all there if you haven't been here. I manage the garden with a small group of volunteers and we do it completely organically. I've never used any kind of fertilizer out there or pesticide. The only pesticide I've ever used is an organically approved fire ant treatment. And it's been a really bad year or good year for fire ants. I've got bites on my hand as we speak from working in the garden. They've been really getting me lately. So we do manage those with some orange oil. But other than that, we don't use any kind of pesticide or fertilizer. The garden, I created it to serve as outreach for doing tours and workshops. Typically in a typical year, when we're not having a COVID pandemic, I would do dozens of tours, both private and public, and also all-day workshops for the public. And then this year, I also I'm a photographer, so I really enjoy taking pictures and educating people through photos from the garden, and I post on social media. So this year I've switched to doing some virtual garden tour videos since I can't do public tours. You're gonna be seeing a lot of website links in my presentation, and I will find a way. We'll talk as a committee and figure out how to email y'all later with links. So you don't need to worry about trying to write all these down. We're gonna email you the links to all the resources I mentioned. So for pollinators, continuing that theme, pollinators also appreciate a diversity of blooms. You really wanna target from early spring to late fall. And that helps you attract a diversity of pollinators. So look at all these different types of flowers. They like different colors, different shapes, different sizes, and that helps attract pollinators. You know, we've got tiny physical body size, like this Serratina, which is actually a carpenter bee. And then you've got tiny little butterflies, like this Eastern tail blue. And then you've got big, you know, plump bumblebees that can just muscle their way into a flower and open it up and bypass, you know, the stamens in some case and just go right to the nectar. And then you've got also long-tongued pollinators, and even among the bees, you have long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees. So the long-tongued bees are able to access, you know, deeper flowers, tubular flowers. And then your long-tongued butterflies, of course, same thing, can access different types of flowers. And then you have short-tongued pollinators, like the sweat bee, that are going to require small, shallow flowers that are open, like this composite aster, where they can just dip their tongue into a shallow flower and are able to access the nectar. And also the syrphid fly is considered a short-tongued pollinator on this climbing aster. So think about, so I've mentioned bees. In North Carolina, we have over 560 species of bees that are native to North Carolina. There's a lot of diversity out there, a lot of diversity in color and shape and size, not just of flowers, but also the bees. And normally, you know, I do talks on this, and I would do a whole day on talking just about bees. We got a lot of wildlife to talk about today. So for pollinator gardens, you want to have a minimum of 3 to 5 species blooming each season from spring to fall. That's not hard to do. I mean, right now, I think in the pollinator garden, I've probably got about 50 or 60 species blooming even this time of year, probably closer to 50. I need to update my bloom list. And if you have a smaller plant, like a coneflower, I would encourage you to group 3 or 4 or 5 of them together to make a bigger mass of them and improve the foraging efficiency of pollinators. And of course, by having this diversity, you're going to have a lot of seasonal interest. So that means blooms late into the year. Like I said, we've got a lot of things blooming even now. You've got your grasses, You've got your native shrubs like viburnums that are putting on those fruits for birds. And even in the winter, your seasonal interest would include those seed heads, which are both beautiful, but also, you know, provide sustenance for birds. You've got some evergreens like this native yucca and the gallberries, and then of course your grasses. And I think seed heads are beautiful in the garden. So we do not rush to cut those down. We want to leave them for birds. This is ironweed and bee balm in this shot. Okay, so also another trick that I do is when I identify plants as being particularly attractive to pollinators, I like to have multiple species of them. And that really can help extend the bloom season. So an example would be asters. I've got about 12 species of aster in my garden, and they're all different. There's different bloom periods, different growth habits. Some are mounding, you know, kind of a round shape. Others have a very open canopy. Some like part shade, some like full sun, you know, different size flowers. The Eastern Silvery Aster just blooms along the stem, very unique. And similarly with the goldenrod, I've got about 10 or 12 species of that. And that means that my goldenrod, because I have so many different species, it starts blooming in July and goes through November. So that's the benefit of having those multiple species. You can really lengthen that bloom period and help your pollinators and other wildlife. Another example would be the milkweeds. I have 10 species of native milkweed in the garden, and the same thing. Some like full sun, some like part shade. You know, your poke milkweed likes part shade. Some have very fine leaves, like the Asclepias verticillata, the world milkweed, very skinny leaves, and then compare that with the common milkweed, the Asclepias syriaca, very coarse leaves. But again, different, some like dry, some like wet. So it's just depending on what kind of habitat you have at your home also can dictate what species you have. Of course, in a pollinator garden, you're going to include host plants for butterflies. So this is a monarch on the butterfly weed. And here's, of course, the caterpillar that comes along. And that's probably not, never mind. The video is probably not going to work in this mode. Nothing's going to work because of the way we're showing this. I had some videos that you're not going to get to see because my computer's not cooperating. The black swallowtail butterfly, this is the native host, the golden Alexander. Typically people see them on their fennel or their parsley or their dill. There's one of the caterpillars and the beautiful butterfly. And then here's a close-up of the later instar caterpillar feeding. And then the pipevine swallowtail, I love. So, you know, the landscaping for wildlife does require for people kind of a shift. I know Margaret had mentioned, like, how do some of these invasive plants become popular? Well, she said because they're resistant to pests. And sure enough, as an extension agent, I get, you know, lots of calls from people, more so in the past, but even today, where they say, what can I plant that nothing will eat? And my response is, well, why would you want to do that? So that's what I mean by it requires a shift. I'm planting things so that caterpillars will come eat it. And it just takes that kind of knowledge to know that that's benefiting, and it's not going to kill the plant. So I plant pipevine so that I can have this butterfly come and lay eggs, and the caterpillars will eat it. So here's the picture of the just hatched pipevine swallowtail, just from the eggshells there. And then here's a few days later, all the young caterpillars feeding on the leaf. And then this is supposed to be a video, which won't work. And then here's the latest instar. And I'll tell you what, just yesterday, I still was finding a couple of these caterpillars on my vines. We've had several generations in the garden this year. The spicebush swallowtail, same thing. I planted the spicebush just so I could have these caterpillars come eat it. And here's the most gorgeous caterpillar. I just love those blue dots on the green. And often with the spicebush, what you'll see is they fold a leaf over on top of them and hide out when they're not feeding, protection from the sun, because the leaf has a phytochemical that makes them sensitive to sunlight. So a lot of times you may notice the folded over leaf before you see the caterpillar, especially when the caterpillars are really tiny and they're like the size of a grain of rice, you know. So look for those folded over leaves. You can also see the hummingbird clearwing moth caterpillars, especially on things like, you know, the coral honeysuckle. And there's a picture of the adult moth at the bottom, a clearwing moth. I love the variegated fritillary. So this is an egg on the host plant, which is passion flower. And here's the beautiful adult with the passion flower flower. And there's the really pretty butterfly caterpillar, excuse me. I'm still seeing those as well out in the garden too, well into October. This was kind of fun to catch this. One day I was working in the garden and I saw the variegated fritillary caterpillar in that J shape. And whenever you see that, you know they're preparing to form a chrysalis. And the middle picture is it's straightened out a little, but it's thickening up. And then the final picture was 1 day later of the chrysalis formed on this ironweed. And here's another view of a different chrysalis on a different plant, but just showing you how beautiful that chrysalis is. And I'm going to send you a link to a publication, NC State, that gives you more information on butterfly host plants. And just to show you what I was alluding to earlier, that when you plant for pollinators, you're supporting a lot of other critters that are not pollinators. So here's an example. You know, everything from, I love spiders as well, reptiles, amphibians, other predators like assassin bugs and praying mantids and predatory stink bugs. Even bats will come, and I love helping bats as well. They need our help, and they'll come in the night and eat a lot of the insects. And also robber flies, you know, Carolina knolls, ambush bugs, lady beetles, all kinds of fun stuff to see out there in the garden when you plant for pollinators. So very quickly, I'm going to run through my top, I'm watching the time here, top 25 native pollinator plants. I've got information about these plants on my website, so this is going to be really quick. And then I'm going to share a few snapshots from the garden for each season. So spring blooming would include spiderwort. It'll often rebloom a little bit in the fall. The penstemons, I've got a few species of beard tongue or penstemon in the garden. This is what it looks like. Wild indigo is a real favorite of mine. I've got several species of that, as well as different cultivars. And it's a favorite, especially with the bumblebees, as you see here. Golden Alexander is a favorite among pollinators like this mining bee, but also is the native host for the black swallowtail caterpillar. So that's nice to have that native host. The coneflowers, they'll bloom from spring to fall. Here's an American lady butterfly. And then the blanket flowers will also bloom all the way from spring into fall. They're still blooming. And then Stokes Aster is a little leafcutter bee. It's the evergreen, primarily blooms in the spring. Here's a nice combination of Stokes Aster. The bee balms, I've got several species of native Monarda in the garden. And it's a really nice one to have for all kinds of butterflies, bees, and hummingbirds. I love this New Jersey tea as a shrub, a deciduous shrub. It's really nice. Close up, especially bumblebees, but all kinds of mining bees and flower flies, love it. Just really quickly, I'm just showing you some snapshots from the garden in the spring. It's a beautiful place to visit, lots of activity. All of these pictures are on my website and in my, so if you go to the website and watch the virtual garden tours, you'll get to see all this narrated, so you'll know what you're looking at. Viburnum. I love my native thistles. I'm on a mission to get people excited about thistles. You know, they get a bad rap because people think of the invasive ones. I'm planting the native ones. I've planted them from seed. Some summer blooming, my top 25 summer blooming would include Liatris. And again, I have several species of Liatris, really popular with bees and butterflies. I'm really bummed that y'all can't see the, because I don't think you're even seeing the slide the way it's supposed to show, but it is what it is. I've got several species of mountain mint that also attracts a really diverse group of insects and other critters. Some of the milkweeds. Butterfly weed. I love Culver's root. If you've got a wet spot, it does really great, but it doesn't require a wet spot because I don't have any moist soil in my garden, but it's definitely one of my favorites. It blooms for a couple of months. This is a relative of Jopai weed, bone set. And the great blue lobelia tends to do better than its neighbor, the cousin, the cardinal flower, which requires more moist soil. Rattlesnake master is another favorite, attracts a lot of diversity. Beautiful plant, really unusual, very architectural. The Verbena Hastada, especially with its tiny flowers, really favored among the native bees like the leafcutter bee. St. John's wort is a great shrub to have, really crazy bloom, and the bees go crazy over it. Bumblebees and honeybees primarily. One of my very favorites, you see I have a lot of favorites, I get teased about that. Buttonbush, it has bloomed from June, it's still blooming, 4 months at least of bloom, I love it. It's known as a wetland plant, but trust me, I have it in dry soil and it does very, very well. Joe Pye weed is great. And then just some summer snapshots, passion flower. This is the yellow passion flower. Mountain mint. I'm trying to watch the time down there. One of my favorite vines, the spurred butterfly pea. You see the bumblebees love that one. Sunflower bee. That's actually a bike rack. One of our phloxes. Some fall blooming favorites, of course, the asters are going to have to be in there. Lots of different asters, as I said. Lots of different goldenrods. Ironweeds, I've got a few different ironweeds. Spotted horse mint. Ooh, I'm speeding up. I love the climbing aster vine. So this is on a trellis, but I've also experimentally planted it as a shrub and it's doing great because I ran out of trellis space. So I've now planted several as a shrub and I love them. So I highly recommend it. It'll bloom all the way into winter. I mean, even February, if it's not one of those winters where we're having below, 10 degrees or whatever. Sunflower bee. I'm winding down. Okay, I need to get going because I got to talk about birds real quick. I'm going the wrong way. Okay.
Yeah, Debbie, you got just a few minutes there.
So birds, just really quickly, we've already talked about what they need. I've got some examples of soft mass fruits from different seasons. So these are the soft fruits, things you think of, pokeweed, beautyberry. And then your hard mass fruits, hard seeds, they can come from grasses, they can come from things like black-eyed Susans. And then I love seeing birds. I get lots of birds in the Pollinator Garden. That's supposed to be a video, that's not gonna work. Possum haw carry fruit all the way into the winter. Hummingbirds, it's so satisfying to be able to provide plants for them and not just have them coming to your feeder. So you've got shrubs, things like buttonbush, buckeye, New Jersey tea are great for hummingbirds. Your vines can be, coral honeysuckle, passion flower, and then lots of different perennials for hummingbirds, cardinal flowers, beard tongue, monarda, obedient plant, blazing star, columbines, fire pinks, phlox, the rose mallow. I love the pink turtle heads. Okay, we're going to skip that poll. So I wanted to show you, I'm finishing up, this is the end of it, a couple of tools to help you select plants for your garden. And again, we're going to send you this website. So the NC State has this Going Native website. It's really cool. So you can go on this website and you can say, I'm in the Piedmont, I want recommendations on trees, or you can pick a shrub or a vine or a grass. And I have light, part shade, at whatever. You select the parameters and it will give you recommendations. It's pretty cool. The National Wildlife Federation also has this. It'll spit out those keystone plants for you. You put in your zip code and it'll give you it'll say goldenrod supports 102 species of butterflies and moths. And then you can click on it and get more details. That's pretty cool too. And then also the National Audubon Society has their plants for birds. And you put in your zip code again, and you can get really great results, recommendations for like this. And the other neat thing, if you click on the buy now, once it gives you your list for your region, it will actually list the native plant nurseries in your region, which is a really great feature. So the resources, again, we're going to share these with you through email. These are all the cooperative extension ones, some great publications, and also my website. And by the way, I'm trying to work on putting up a pollinator guide online. And then here's the non-extension ones: Audubon, Wildlife, Xerces. And then I've got, again, the virtual tours on there. And that's it. I went a little bit over time. I'm really sorry my PowerPoint didn't work like it was supposed to, but hopefully you could see somewhat of the picture.
That is great. Thank you so much, Debbie. I think most people, I think Debbie said it several times, she's going to send several of the links out via the email that you received this link from. So she'll be sending a lot of information out. She does have a website. You can check her out on the Growing Small Farms as well. And if we could just answer one question, the biggest thing, Debbie, is where is the best place for people to go find either native plants that are already potted or looking for native seeds?
Oh, it really depends on where you are. I know y'all are all over the state. If you go to my website, I've got a listing of nurseries. So right here in Chatham County, we are actually pretty blessed to have some good nurseries. In Chatham and surrounding counties, you've got Mellow Marsh Farm, which is a large wholesale nursery. They do have a $100 minimum order. So that's if you're either looking to do a bigger planting or go in with a few of your neighbors. The North Carolina Botanical Garden has amazing plants. I get some of my very favorite natives from them. They just are in the middle of their fall plant sale, but get on their list, become a member. And they just did they did it online this year because of COVID. And then we have some other nurseries here. Niche Gardens just closed down, but we've got some other local nurseries, Big Bloomers and Growing Wild. I've got them, Cure Nursery right here in Chatham County. I've got them all listed on my website. I will send y'all the link to that in the next day or so.
And Debbie, I'll just jump in really quick. I don't know if this changed because of COVID, but Mellow Marsh Farms, I know I personally bought from this year and they didn't have that minimum. So I don't know if that's a change or just special because of COVID, but.
Interesting, because they actually just implemented the minimum. It didn't used to be a thing, but I think, so yeah, you just have to ask them. But it ain't hard to spend $100, I'm telling you. So, but yeah, we're really lucky to have them. But use that feature on the Audubon thing to find, look, because if y'all are in a faraway county, you know, you may have some that are near to you. And I occasionally mail order plants, but I really, only if the local nurseries don't have them as a last resort. Yeah.
Okay. And just in general, Debbie, would you say that most of these plants are perennials versus annuals?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry to make that clear. They're all perennials. And yes, they're all perennials. I only plant every single plant that I showed you in my presentation was a perennial. Yeah, plant perennials. What was the saying? Friends don't let friends buy annuals. Just there's a few annuals that I plant, but also when I mentioned the nurseries on my website, that also includes some seed suppliers. So for those of you who want to do it that way, yeah.
Awesome, that is great. I think Debbie could probably talk all day on this and would love to share more information. So check her out on Facebook, or if you do social media, or maybe take a trip to the Chatham Pollinator Garden. There's a lot of information there. Or check out the North Carolina Botanical Garden as well. They're very close to each other. So that is great. So we're running a little behind, so we're just gonna move on very quickly. Now we do have, for those of you that may have a lot more questions, we do have a Zoom link. It's kind of like our after party. We do have that up and running. And Laurel, if you could post that into the chat box, I think once we end this meeting, if you're interested or have some questions or wanted to talk with Margaret or wanted to talk with Debbie, they will be in that chat room for about 30 minutes. So if you wanted to come and just ask questions, they'd love to hear about it. Before we go, though, we do have some other things we'd like to share. Make sure I can share my screen here. There we go. Appreciate that feature. Okay, so of course here at Forest Her, we love to have giveaways. We love for people to take something away with them. And it's kind of hard when we're doing it virtual, but we do have our pretty cool travel mug. So we have a new fancy Forest Her NC travel mug we like to give away to 2 people that are still hanging with us there. So Autumn Norris or Ruth McDaniel, are either one of y'all still on here? You could, let's see, does anybody see if they are still there? Ruth McDaniel. All right.
Ruth said in the chat box that she's here.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Ruth. All right, what about Autumn Norris? Yeah, okay. Ruth McDaniel is here. All right. Well, doesn't look like Autumn is, so how about Roxanne Newton? Roxanne Newton, are you still out there hanging on with us? If you are, just type that in the chat box. Ruth will definitely be hearing from us, so look for an email from Forest Her, and we will ask you what the best way to get this travel mug to you is. So be on the lookout for that. I still don't see anything from Roxanne Newton or Autumn Norris.
Roxanne is here.
Roxanne is here. There you are. All right, great. Congratulations, ladies. Your new travel mug, we will get out to you. The next thing we did want to ask, so if you did not, if you're not a lucky person from the lottery here, if you wanted to purchase one, we do have them for sale. The plan was to just offer these for sale at our day-long workshops, but obviously that is not an option right now. So if you wanted to order one by mail, then you can please make a request for that. You can send in your order by mail, make a check out to the NC Tree Farm program. NC Tree Farm program has been gracious enough to help out Forest Her and has offered a way for Forest Her to be able to accept donations, be able to put on workshops, be able to account for all of the funds that are coming into Forest Her. So we are very appreciative of that. So if you're interested in a mug, please feel free. There are $22.50 simply due to shipping and handling. That is a large cost of the mug as well. But you can make your check out to NC Tree Farm program, but please make sure you write attention Forest Her NC. And on the memo line at the bottom, if you would just write Forest Her travel mug, that way all the checks are kept separate. You can see on the screen, if you're interested, there's the Tree Farm program, which is at 1807 Dunwich Court in Apex. And if you're interested, if you could please just get your order in by November 1st. If you send us a check tomorrow, we're just it'll be after November 1st before we get your mug mailed out to you. We're gonna just try to do all of that at one time. So if you please would just be patient with us, we will get it out with promise.
Hey,
right.
Jennifer,
Yes.
real quick on those travel mugs, if you guys are wanting to purchase one, obviously fill out the information on the check, but please be sure to include your shipping address. So if you have a PO box, we need an actual physical address of where to ship it to as well.
Great, yes. Where to ship it back, a physical address, that is very important. All right, thank you, Kelly. So we also wanted to draw your attention to some of our upcoming meetings. Like I said, this was the second meeting of the Managing Wildlife Workshop Series. So we have 2 more meetings coming up. The next one is next month in November, where we will be talking about managing your woods for wildlife, and then the opposite of that, managing your fields for wildlife. So there's 2 different practices there. So we hope that you would join us then. And the last meeting of the Managing for Wildlife series will be in December. And we'll talk about human-wildlife interactions, what you do when you find an injured animal, as well as learning to identify those wildlife tracks by looking at the tracks that you might see along our streams or looking at the markings. So as you are out and about enjoying your woods, that you can actually learn more about identifying them and learn what's actually used in your property. So we hope that you plan to join us then. All right, well, as you're leaving, if you're interested in connecting more with Forest Her, please, you can check us out on social media, Facebook, Instagram. We do have an email listserv, as most of you have gotten the links for this webinar. So please check those out. If you did not receive an email today and you would like to, our email is foresternc@gmail.com. So please send us an email. If you have a story that you wanted to share about your property, or please feel free. We'd love to hear from you. The more that we can connect, the better, particularly given that a lot of our connections now are virtually. we do have a Facebook group that we wanted to draw your attention to today. And that is an opportunity for you to join. You just ask to join, answer a few questions, learn the rules of the group. And it's an opportunity there for you to ask questions about maybe what you're seeing in your yard as you walk through the woods, or maybe some local help where you can go find who can actually come out on your property and help you identify things or walk through your woods. So an opportunity to share and learn and connect with other women across the state and hopefully in your local area as well. So please check those out. If you are, as you leave our meeting today, it will take you to an evaluation link, and we ask you, please, 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 if you would fill that out. That the evaluation helps us. It helps to understand more what you are looking to learn. It helps us to understand what workshops to put on, how to answer questions, and how to connect with the public, because that's what we're all here to do. So please just take a few seconds to fill that out. We do appreciate that. Let's see, Laurel, did you put the link in the chat box?
Yeah, I did. So if you want to join the after meeting or go directly to the evaluation, for some reason you don't get redirected, those should both box.
Okay, all right, great. Yeah, so feel free to stay on. If you want to join us afterwards, just click on the after party link. There's also the evaluation link that we can gather more information from you. But other than that, we thank you very much for taking the time and joining us today. Look for more information in your email coming about the talks that you heard today. And if we can do anything for you, please reach out. So get outside, and we hope you're staying safe, staying positive, and have a great fall. Thank you for joining us. Bye.